If you're listening to this, the 59th weekly Friday show from Radio Free UK Online, do remember you can click through to visit the original items, whether it's a blog, podcast or a YouTube video. And as we carry a wide selection to give you a good taste, if there's anything you like particularly, why not subscribe to them directly? That way, everyone wins. This next item is a news item I found on Breitbart, from one Peter Sutherland, who really is an evil monster. He's anti-Western, anti-civilization, he's a lunatic. But he's a rich and powerful lunatic, so a risk to us all. He basically wants to exterminate Europeans. He pretends that he's just pro-migrant, but in this piece he gives away the game when he talks about North America, Australia and New Zealand all soon having minority European populations, something he approves of. But as those people were originally migrants, why does he object to them? He seems to like other migrants. The only answer really is, he hates Europeans and wants to exterminate us. He's powerful within the UN, he's a former chairman of Goldman Sachs bankers, so he's got money, power and influence. But believe me, he's our enemy. So this is what Breitbart reported. From Breitbart.com. Migration Chief. Europe must open its borders to all, including economic migrants. By Virginia Hale, 21st of July. United Nations representative and former Goldman Sachs banker Peter Sutherland has declared that European countries must open their borders to all, including economic migrants. Mr. Sutherland said that refusal to accept everyone who wants to live in Europe is an affront to the European values of dignity and equality of man. Economic migrants, he claims, are survival fighters and the future of Europe. Speaking on a panel about immigration in Berlin, Mr. Sutherland, the UN Special Representative to the Secretary-General for International Migration, also argued that European leaders must tackle populism, which he says runs counter to the European Union (EU) values. The UN Migration Chief said the EU must find a solution to the problem of xenophobic populism, calling opposition to open borders counter to the values of the EU, the dignity of man and the equality of man. Mr. Sutherland contended that the EU should not be blamed for opening the floodgates of migration, as it is down to the absolute failure of member states, its governments. Mr. Sutherland, who is the youngest person ever appointed to the European Commission, slammed governments in the EU who he said are playing up the nationalist card, feeding the populism of those who do not believe in the fundamental values that we have. He argued that European leaders should stop pussyfooting around migration, and that it's necessary now to engage with the EU values, which he said includes open borders for economic migrants. Mr. Sutherland said, "We're not just talking about refugees, we're talking about economic migrants, many of whom can be the future, and some at the present. They're survival fighters, they're not to be dismissed as an irrelevance." Concluding his main contribution to the panel, Mr. Sutherland said business is partial to Europe having an open borders policy, but expressed his belief that they're not being proactive enough in the debate. Mr. Sutherland also lamented the fact that his critics often bring up his position as Goldman Sachs chairman for 20 years, from which he only stepped down in 2015. Because of his banking role, he says critics diminish me for bringing us together and giving us the opportunity of making and discussing the arguments as to how migration can best be had. Responding to a question from a journalist, Mr. Sutherland said it's the media's responsibility to counter populism by reporting the facts about migration in a positive way. The press is the biggest failure, in my opinion, in this debate, because far from abating the populism, which is creating xenophobia, the organisations are doing the opposite, the UN representative argued. It is unclear why Mr. Sutherland believes mass migration of unskilled migrants from poor countries would benefit the European economies, when the facts suggest there is a serious drain on the EU states' resources. Non-EU migrants cost the UK Treasury £17 billion a year, net, while on the continent they have more than double the unemployment rate of Europeans. This is borne out by a variety of data sets from different European countries. For example, 65% of non-European migrants who arrived in the Netherlands during the 1990s are still living on welfare. A report by the Institute of Public Policy Research noted that the employment rate of people with Somali backgrounds in the UK has rarely been above 20%. In addition to this, Mr. Sutherland's warning that offsetting ageing populations with migrants is essential for Europe is not borne out by the reality. In December, The Bank of England forecasts that in the coming years, half of the jobs in Britain will be lost to robots as a result of automation. The population of Japan is in the process of aging and shrinking dramatically, but the nation has rejected repeated calls for mass migration to offset this. The IMF noted that foreign labour makes up just 0.3% of Japan's labour force. As of January this year, the country's unemployment rate was just 3.2%, and the Japanese enjoy some of the highest living standards in the world. In 2012, Mr. Sutherland stated that European countries must become multicultural, however difficult it may be to explain to the citizens of those states, calling migration a crucial dynamic for economic growth. He said the EU should undermine the homogeneity of its member states. Ireland's former Attorney General pointed to North America, Australia and New Zealand, countries where people of European descent will soon be a minority, as successful examples of this. The founding Director General of the World Trade Organization told the House of Lords EU Home Affairs Subcommittee, which was investigating global migration, that, at the most basic level, individuals should have freedom of choice about where to live. He also said that EU states should stop targeting highly skilled migrants and end restrictions on low-skilled migrants.